They say people like me are invisible. I used to believe that too until the day Ryan Hayes looked at me. Not in the way a man looks at a woman. Not with warmth or contempt. Just acknowledgement. Like I actually existed. It was 6:15 a.m. The courthouse was still sleeping under the weight of its marble columns and echoing hallways. My hands were raw from the cold water in the mop bucket. I pushed the cart forward, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Once, years ago, I imagined walking these halls in a suitcase files under my arm, my name whispered in respect. Hannah Ruiz, J.D. That was before Dad's store burned down, before Mom's heart attack, before I traded textbooks for bleach and scrub brushes. Now I clean. A man's voice echoed down the corridor. Counselor, you don't understand. I can't wait any longer. I froze. There he was. Ryan Hayes. Even from a distance he had that posture, shoulders squared like the Marine he used to be. Jaw-tight blue eyes, sharp. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, but there was a frayed edge to him like a uniform worn too many times. His lawyer trailed behind, adjusting his tie nervously. Mr. Hayes, I'm doing my best. But the prosecution, Ryan turned and his gaze brushed over me. Just for a second. It wasn't pity, or disgust, or even curiosity. It was acknowledgement. No one looks at the cleaners. Not the lawyers. Not the judges. Not the defendants. We're ghosts. I kept my head down scrubbing at a coffee stain that had been there for days. My fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of something I couldn't name. I had read about him in the papers. Ex-Marine. Decorated twice in Afghanistan. Accused of falsifying military contracts worth millions. Facing federal charges. The lawyer's voice dropped to a whisper. They want you to plead out. Take the deal. Ryan didn't answer. He just stood there staring at the courtroom doors, like a soldier preparing to breach enemy lines. I dipped the mop again, but my eyes stayed on him. Invisible people don't speak. But that day, I wondered what if they did. Most mornings, the courtroom feels like a cathedral to power. Oak panels polished so bright, you could almost see your sins reflected. Brass scales glinting under fluorescent lights. A place where the air is heavy with judgment. But that morning it felt hollow. I shouldn't even have been there. My shift ended an hour ago, but something in me, call it curiosity, call it madness, kept my feet rooted at the edge of the gallery. Ryan Hayes sat at the defense table alone. His lawyer was gone. No note, no explanation. Just an empty chair beside him, a briefcase abandoned like a casualty of war. Ryan's hands were clasped on the table, the knuckles white, the veins taut. He stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. But I could see at the flicker of disbelief in his eyes. The judge adjusted his glasses and sighed impatiently. Mr. Hayes, it appears your counsel has failed to appear. The prosecution is prepared to proceed. Ryan stood abruptly. His voice was low, steady. Your Honor, I ask for a brief continuance. My attorney. This court has been more than accommodating. The gavel slammed against wood. The sound cracked through me like a rifle shot. If counsel fails to appear in the next 5 minutes, we proceed in absentia. There it was. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. From my corner in the shadows, I clenched my rag tighter. My throat felt dry, my chest tight. This man, this soldier, was about to be judged without a defense, and all I could do was watch. The prosecutor, a woman with hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, smirked as she shuffled her papers. She wanted this. A trial without opposition. An easy victory. Ryan's jaw flexed. He glanced back, scanning the rows of empty benches behind him. For a moment our eyes met. It was barely a second, but in that second, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger. Resignation. Like a man preparing to take a bullet because there's no one left to fight beside him. The gavel slammed again. 2 minutes, Mr. Hayes. 2 minutes. I didn't know why my heart was pounding so hard. Maybe because once, long ago, I swore I'd never let someone stand alone in a room like this. But that was before life taught me invisible people don't speak. I tightened my grip on the rag, and I whispered to myself, maybe this time I will. 2 minutes. That's all the judge had given him. I stood frozen in the corner, my cleaning cart between me and the room where lives were decided with the swing of a gavel. My heart pounded loud enough I worried someone might hear it. Ryan Hayes sat rigid at the defense table. His uniform jacket was gone, leaving only a plain white shirt and a tie pulled a little too tight. He wasn't a towering man, but there was something in the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, spine straight, that told me he had once known how to command a room. But not today. Today, he was alone, abandoned in a fight he couldn't win without someone at his side. Then it happened. He turned, just for a moment. His eyes swept over the empty benches behind him, searching for what? A miracle. A lifeline. And then his gaze found me. For a heartbeat, I thought I imagined it. That desperate flicker like a man reaching for air as the water closes overhead. I felt my lungs tighten. It's not your place, Hannah. Stay small. Stay quiet. That's how you survive. But in his eyes, I saw something that pulled me back years to a lecture hall at NYU. My book spread open, my hands trembling with excitement, as I highlighted lines about justice and advocacy. I had wanted to wear the robe, stand before a jury, speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Then, my mother got sick. Medical bills piled up faster than I could count. Dreams don't mean much when rent is due, and insulin costs more than your weekly paycheck. So I put away the books, took the first job I could get, and with every floor, I scrubbed every trash can I emptied. That part of me, the part that believed I could make a difference, grew quieter. Invisible people don't speak. But Ryan Hayes was staring at me like I wasn't invisible at all. The judge's gavel struck again, snapping me out of the memory. 1 minute, the judge barked. Then we proceed without a defense. Ryan's shoulders sagged. He closed his eyes for a brief second, and something inside me snapped. Before I could think, before I could remind myself of all the reasons to stay silent, I was moving. My shoes squeaked against the polished floor as I stepped out from the shadows. Heads turned. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Your Honor. My voice came out softer than I intended, but it carried. Every eye in the courtroom swung toward me. Your Honor, I said again, firmer this time. My hands clenched at my sides. May I speak for him? A stunned silence settled over the room. The prosecutor's lips curled into a smirk. The judge raised his brows, peering at me over his glasses. Who are you? He asked. I swallowed, hard heat rising to my face. A janitor, I admitted, but I studied law. 2 years at NYU before Your Honor. The prosecutor shot up from her seat. This is absurd. The judge silenced her with a raised hand. Let her speak, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. My knees were trembling, but my voice grew steadier. I know this case. I know what's at stake. And if you let me, I'll speak for him until his counsel arrives. Ryan hadn't moved. But his eyes, those gray, stormy eyes, locked on mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The words had barely left my lips when the first snicker rippled through the courtroom. "May I speak for him?" It sounded braver in my head. Out loud it hung in the air, fragile and trembling like a bird with broken wings. Then came the laughter. Low at first. A sharp exhale from one of the reporters seated along the back wall. The shuffle of shoes as two paralegals leaned toward each other smirking. And then it spread. The sound of amused disbelief growing louder until it bounced off the mahogany panels and marble floor. A man in an expensive suit near the front let out a full, barking laugh. A janitor. Someone whispered too loudly for it to be an accident. What is this, some kind of joke? My fingers tightened around the edges of my cleaning apron. I wanted to disappear. The prosecutor, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a crimson blazer, stood and tilted her head like she was addressing a confused child. "Your Honor," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Are we seriously entertaining this A-cleaner, representing a soldier in a federal court? This isn't a movie." A fresh wave of chuckles. I felt my face flush hot. Maybe this was a mistake. What was I doing standing here in scuffed sneakers and an old polo shirt pretending I still belonged in this world of polished lawyers and sharp-tongued judges? For a split second I considered retreating. I could mumble an apology, back away with my cart, pretend I hadn't just humiliated myself in front of a room full of strangers. Then I heard it. "Miss." His voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the laughter, but it stopped me cold. Ryan. He was still sitting there, still alone, still watching me. Not with amusement. Not with derision. But with something else entirely. Desperation. And trust. As if for reasons I couldn't fathom, he believed in me. I straightened my back. "I know how this looks," I said, my voice stronger this time. "But I'm not asking for your amusement. I'm asking for a chance to make this right." The laughter quieted just a little. The judge leaned forward, studying me, as though weighing the weight of my words. And in that heavy silence I realized, if I backed down now, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. The courtroom was still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to have stopped humming as the judge's eyes fixed on me. I'd seen those eyes before, sharp gray, tired of excuses. Judge Henderson was known for being fair, but impatient. He wasn't a man who liked surprises, least of all from a janitor, clutching a spray bottle and speaking out of turn. "Miss," he said slowly, his voice deep and deliberate, "do you have any legal qualifications?" My mouth felt dry. I studied law," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "At NYU. 2 years. But I had to leave." "Why?" That word landed heavy. Why, I saw my mother's face in my mind drawn pale, her hair in wisps on the hospital pillow. The bills piling up on the kitchen counter. The phone calls from creditors. I'd been 22, barely scraping by on scholarships and part-time jobs. When her cancer came back aggressive and unrelenting, I didn't hesitate. I left my dreams behind for mop buckets and night shifts. "My mother was sick," I said finally. "She needed me, and I needed money." A murmur went through the room. Not pity, just curiosity. Ryan turned his head toward me for the first time since I spoke. His face was as unreadable as always, square jaw, sharp features, the kind of presence that drew eyes even in silence. "Don't do this," he whispered so softly I almost didn't hear. But then he added even softer, "But thank you." It caught me off guard. He didn't look like the kind of man who said thank you easily. I swallowed hard. I know I'm not a lawyer, I said louder now, addressing Judge Henderson directly, but I've followed this case. I've cleaned this courtroom every night for weeks. I've seen the files left open on desks. I've listened. Another murmur. Was that admiration in a few faces, or just disbelief? Judge Henderson rubbed the bridge of his nose. This isn't how things are done, he muttered. But sometimes circumstances call for unusual measures. He fixed me with those gray eyes again. You may speak on his behalf for now, but be warned any mistake, any sign of incompetence, and I will dismiss you immediately. Yes, Your Honor. My hands were shaking, but I clasped them tight to hide it. As I stepped forward, Ryan's gaze followed me. For a split second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something unspoken. Hope or fear. Maybe both. And as I stood behind the defense table, I couldn't help but think of the last time I'd been this close to the law. Young, ambitious, believing I could change the world. Back then, I didn't know life had other plans for me. But maybe this was my second chance. The courtroom felt colder when I put the mop down. It wasn't just the air conditioning. It was the stairs. Every eye in that wood-paneled room turned to me, the janitor with a frayed uniform and sneakers smudged from bleach. I could feel their disbelief pressing against my skin like invisible fingers. The judge's gavel echoed one sharp crack. You have 15 minutes, Ms. Hannah Morales, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 15 minutes, he repeated. That's all. Convince me you're not wasting the court's time. I nodded. I'd cleaned this courtroom for months, wiped every bench, dusted every plaque on the wall, polished this very table I was about to stand behind. But now as I stepped toward it, it felt different. It wasn't wood and polish anymore. It was a threshold. I picked up the case file. The edges were worn from Ryan's lawyer flipping through it, a lawyer who hadn't even bothered to show up today. And across the aisle, the prosecutor's slick-suit perfect hair was smirking at me. A janitor defending a dishonorably discharged soldier, he whispered to his colleague. This'll be quick. I heard it. I let it hang in the air. Ryan didn't smirk. He didn't look embarrassed, but he didn't look confident either. His face was a mask of conflict, like a man who'd learned to hide his emotions, but couldn't quite bury them all. I glanced at him briefly. Do you trust me? I asked under my breath. He blinked, surprised. No, he whispered back. But I've got no one else. Fair enough. I placed the file gently on the table and smoothed out my uniform shirt. My palms were sweaty, but I clenched them tight until they stopped shaking. The judge leaned forward in his chair. Whenever you're ready, Ms. Morales. I looked up at the gallery, rows of strangers, a few journalists scribbling eagerly in notebooks, cameras waiting for their headline, Cleaner Turns Lawyer in Courtroom Drama. They expected me to fail. Maybe they wanted me to, but I wasn't here for them. I was here for a man who, for reasons I still didn't fully understand, had fought tooth and nail to protect his honor, only to be abandoned at the finish line. I was here for the 20-year-old me, who once believed in justice, before bills and sickness and survival stole her voice. I was here because someone had to speak, and right now, I was the only one willing to do it. I took a deep breath, and as my lungs filled, I could feel the weight of every choice that had led me here. The judge's eyes were still on me, Ryan's too, so I let the breath out slowly, lifted my chin, and said, Your Honor, I never thought I'd stand here again, not behind a lectern, not with my voice trembling, not with the weight of justice pressing down on me like this. But I wasn't 20 anymore. I wasn't the girl in the NYU lecture hall, her head buried in textbooks, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Hannah, you're going to change the law one day," he used to say. He'd kiss my forehead before heading to his night shift at the factory. "And when you do remember, change it for people like us." Back then I believed him. I believed the world would open up to anyone willing to work hard enough. But that was before cancer hollowed out my family's savings. Before I left school to hold my mother's hand through chemo, and wiped tables in a diner to pay the rent. Before I became invisible. Now I was back in a courtroom, not as a lawyer, not even as a student, but as a janitor, standing where I was never meant to stand. "Your Honor," I said, my voice catching slightly. "If I may, I'd like to address the charges against Mr. Brooks." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, the prosecutor leaned back, twirling his pen with a smirk. "The floor's yours," the judge said. I straightened the papers on the table, not because I needed to, but because my hands were shaking. Mr. Brooks is accused of insubordination and gross misconduct during his final deployment. I began keeping my tone calm. The report claims he disobeyed a direct order, resulting in the loss of classified equipment. "That's correct," the prosecutor interjected smoothly. "An act that endangered national security." But I countered the so-called classified equipment in question was later recovered unharmed within 24 hours, wasn't it? His pen stopped spinning. "That's irrelevant," he said too quickly. "On the contrary," I said, stepping closer, "the recovery timeline matters. It shows the incident didn't cause lasting damage. More importantly, it raises the question, why was Mr. Brooks' commanding officer so quick to recommend a dishonorable discharge for an error that was immediately rectified?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. I turned back to the judge. I would also like to point out that key witnesses were not called to testify during the initial hearing, I said. Witnesses who could attest to Mr. Brooks's record of service, including his commendation for valor 3 months prior. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. I saw it then, the flicker in his eyes. The calculation. He hadn't expected me to know about the commendation. He definitely hadn't expected me to bring it up. Ryan glanced at me from the defense table. His jaw tightened, but there was something new in his expression now. Not pity, not skepticism, hope. For a second, I thought the words would dry up in my throat. The air in the courtroom felt thick, like walking through water. My palms were damp, my knees still a little unsteady. But somewhere between the judge's steady gaze and Ryan's clenched jaw, I found my center. I took a breath. "Your Honor." I said, my voice stronger now. I believe there are key elements missing from the prosecution's narrative. Elements that, if examined properly, could shift how this court views Mr. Brooks's actions entirely. Before I could continue, the prosecutor shot to his feet. "This is absurd," he barked. "We're wasting the court's time. This woman isn't licensed to practice law. She's a janitor, for God's sake. She shouldn't even be standing there." The words stung, but I refused to flinch. "Yes, I am a janitor," I said evenly, turning to face him. "But I also completed 3 years at NYU Law before circumstances forced me to leave. I'm not asking the court to recognize me as an attorney. I'm asking the court to recognize the facts." The gallery went quiet. Even the reporters seemed unsure whether to take notes or just watch. "Your Honor." The prosecutor pressed on, his face flushed. "This is highly irregular." I moved to dismiss her from this proceeding and continue the hearing without further delay. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Lane," he said to the prosecutor, "while I agree this is unconventional, it's also my responsibility to ensure this man receives a fair defense. And right now," he glanced at Ryan, still seated silently, His counsel has failed to appear. But, Your Honor. Sit down, the judge said firmly. The prosecutor froze, then sank back into his chair, his lips pressed tight. I felt my heart pound in my chest as the judge turned to me. Ms. Reyes, he said, his tone softer now, you have no formal standing in this court. But if you believe you can present relevant arguments, I'll grant you 15 minutes. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to try and save a man I barely knew from being destroyed in front of everyone. I nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Behind me I heard a faint sound, a chair scraping. Ryan had stood up. When I glanced at him, his eyes met mine, blue and sharp, but no longer cold. Don't do this for me, he said under his breath. It's too much to ask. I shook my head slightly. I'm doing it because it's right. For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of something in his expression, not despair, not anger. Trust. I'd read every book in the NYU Law Library about cross-examinations. None of them had prepared me for the reality of standing here, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on me. The first witness, a young corporal with nervous hands, shifted in his seat as I approached. Corporal Jensen. I began my voice steady, despite the hammering of my heart. You testified that you saw Sergeant Brooks leave the base without authorization on the night of April 12th. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. And you're certain it was him? He hesitated. I think so. I mean, he has that build, broad shoulders. Tall. You think so? I repeated gently. But you didn't see his face, did you know, ma'am? It was dark. But he walks a certain way. A certain way, I echoed. Would you say no other man in your unit walks like that? Jensen looked down at his boots. I guess I can't say for sure. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Corporal. I said, taking one step closer, is it possible you made an assumption that night? Because you expected it to be Sergeant Brooks Jensen swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. It's possible. A ripple moved through the gallery. For the first time since I stepped into the courtroom, I felt a surge of confidence. Not because I was winning, but because I was no longer drowning in my own fear. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this line of questioning is misleading and speculative. The judge raised a hand. Overruled, he said coolly. Continue, Ms. Reyes. I nodded, thanking him with my eyes, and turned back to the corporal. One last question. Corporal, did you ever speak to Sergeant Brooks directly about that night? No, ma'am. I didn't. Thank you. No further questions. I stepped back, heart pounding but steady. As I returned to the defense table, I caught Ryan watching me. His expression wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't even guarded. It was proud. And that was almost enough to undo me. I gripped the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking as the judge called for a brief recess. When I stood to gather my papers, I felt a light tap on my arm. Startled, I turned to see a court clerk, mid-30s, kind eyes, slip a folded piece of paper into my hand. Meet me in the hallway, it read. I looked up at him, but he was already walking away, a stack of folders in his arms, as if nothing had happened. My stomach knotted. Was this about the case? About me. I had no idea, but I knew one thing: I couldn't ignore it. As I stood in the empty hallway staring at the note in my hand, a memory clawed its way out of the shadows. It wasn't just about Ryan Brooks. It wasn't just about justice. This went deeper. It was a rainy night in Brooklyn years ago. I had been 21, carrying a backpack stuffed with legal textbooks I could no longer afford to use. The student loans were crushing me. My mother's hospital bills had drained everything else. That evening, I'd walked home from a part-time shift at a diner soaking wet, exhausted, my body begging for rest. Halfway down Flatbush Avenue, I felt my knees buckle. The world tilted sideways. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting under the awning of a bodega rainwater. Dripping from my hair, a stranger crouched beside me. He was maybe 24, dressed in worn jeans and a military jacket. His face was angular, but kind, and his eyes blue-gray, like a storm watched me with quiet concern. "You fainted," he said softly. "Probably low blood sugar. Did you eat today?" I shook my head, embarrassed. He sighed, reaching into his pocket. "Here," he said, pressing a crumpled $20 bill into my palm. "Go inside, buy something warm. Please." I tried to protest. "Pay me back someday," he interrupted with the faintest smile. "Or better yet, help someone else when they need it." And then he was gone. But when I looked down at the bill later, I saw that he'd scrawled something on it with a pen. "You matter." 2 words. Simple. But they burned into me like fire. That night, I didn't know his name. I didn't know he was a soldier about to deploy overseas. I didn't know our paths would cross again in a courtroom years later. But now I understood why I couldn't stay silent. Why I'd risked my job, my dignity, my fragile little world. Because Ryan Brooks had once pulled me back from the edge, and he hadn't even known it. Now it was my turn. I folded the note from the clerk and slipped it into my pocket, resolving to face whatever waited outside. I stepped into the narrow hallway, the click of the courtroom door echoing behind me like a warning. A man stood there leaning casually against the wall, his janitor's uniform as unremarkable as my own. He looked up when he heard me, eyes darting nervously left and right. "You're Hannah, right?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. "You're the one who sent the note?" "Yeah," he said, glancing around again before pulling a manila folder from under his arm. "I don't have much time. If they see me talking to you, it's over for both of us." I frowned. "What is this?" He shoved the folder into my hands. "Proof. That soldier you're defending, Ryan Brooks. He's not guilty. He was set up." The words hit me like a slap. Set up by who I demanded. The same people sitting in that courtroom pretending they care about justice. His voice trembled. Ryan stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see during his deployment. He filed a complaint about misconduct by a commanding officer, illegal weapons sales, civilian deaths, swept under the rug. I opened the folder, my fingers trembling as I scanned page after page of internal memos, emails, financial records. Buried among the files was a grainy photo Ryan in uniform, standing outside a barracks with a younger soldier. The date stamp was 6 months before his court-martial. They needed to silence him, the man said. So they fabricated charges, got a few higher-ups to testify against him. Now they're trying to bury him with a dishonorable discharge and prison time. Make sure no one ever asks questions. I stared at the damning evidence, a chill crawling up my spine. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. "Why risk your job?" "Your safety," he shrugged, "because I've watched you these last few days mopping floors and pretending not to listen. But you hear everything. You care. And I can't live with myself if I let an innocent man go down for this." My heart pounded. This could change everything. But it could also destroy me. If I introduced these files in court without chain of custody, I could be held in contempt, fired, maybe even charged myself. I thought of Ryan sitting alone in that courtroom, his eyes hollow, his hands clenched. and I thought of that rainy night years ago of a soldier who had once handed me $20 and reminded me I mattered. "I can't testify," the man said, breaking into my thoughts. "But those documents, if you're brave enough to use them, they could save his life." "Do they know you have these?" I asked. He gave a bitter laugh. "They'd kill me if they did." A beat of silence stretched between us. Then he stepped back. "Whatever you decide, make it count." And just like that, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me with a folder that felt heavier than the world. I pressed it to my chest and closed my eyes. If I used this, I'd be stepping onto a battlefield with no armor. But if I stayed silent, Ryan Brooks would be condemned for a crime he didn't commit. Was I really going to let that happen? I took a deep breath, hearing the gavel echo faintly from the courtroom. Then I turned, clutching the folder, and walked back toward the door. The folder felt like it was burning a hole through my hands as I walked back down the dimly lit hallway. Each step echoed louder in my ears, then the last like the sound of a countdown. By the time I reached the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, I could hear muffled voices inside the judge, the prosecutor Ryan's name being spoken and clipped in different tones. I stopped for a moment, my palm pressed against the cool wood. "This is insane, Hannah. You're not a lawyer anymore. You're a cleaner with no right to stand in that room and demand to be heard." But then I remembered Ryan's eyes as he sat alone at the defense table. Eyes that weren't begging for salvation, but resigned to being crushed. He had saved me once years ago, without even knowing it. It was time to return the favor. I pushed open the doors. The room went quiet for a second as I stepped inside, the sound of my worn sneakers on marble filling the space. The prosecutor shot me a look of annoyance. Ryan's head snapped up the moment he saw me. "Hannah," he said softly, almost like a warning. But there was something else in his voice, too. Hope. I walked briskly to the defense table and placed the folder down with deliberate care. Ryan leaned toward me. "Are you sure about this?" He murmured, his voice so low only I could hear. I didn't hesitate. "Yes." I met his eyes, and for the first time since this trial began, I saw them flicker with life. The judge cleared his throat impatiently. "Miss, whatever your name is, you have something to say." I took a breath so deep it felt like it might break my ribs. "Yes, Your Honor. There's something the court needs to see." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular, but I didn't back down. This concerns evidence that could exonerate the defendant and expose a much larger injustice." The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge raised an eyebrow, his gavel poised in his hand. "Miss, proceed carefully." I laid my hand on the folder, feeling its weight one last time before I spoke again. "Your Honor, what I'm about to present may change the entire course of this trial." The folder felt heavier than it should have, as I stood there, all eyes fixed on me. "Your Honor," I began, forcing my voice to steady, though my heart thundered in my ears. "I've obtained evidence that directly contradicts the charges against Sergeant Ryan Whitaker." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor shot up from her chair, her heels clicking like gunfire against the polished floor. "Objection. This woman isn't a licensed attorney. She has no right to introduce evidence." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. His sharp gaze cut to me. "Miss, you understand the consequences of presenting false evidence in a federal court?" "Yes, Your Honor." I laid the folder on the bench before him and opened it. this file contains internal communications, whistleblower testimony, and financial records, proving that the charges against Sergeant Whitaker were fabricated. Gasps erupted around the room. According to this evidence, I continued, Ryan's commanding officer, Colonel Harlan Reese, orchestrated the entire setup to cover up his own war crimes overseas. When Ryan reported misconduct, they framed him for the very things he tried to expose. The prosecutor's face flushed crimson. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. These are unverified claims. This trial is a circus." But the judge leaned forward, flipping through the first few pages. His brows furrowed. "These documents," he muttered, his voice low but audible. "If authentic, they suggest not only entrapment, but high-level corruption within the chain of command." I could feel the weight of every stare in the room. Jurors, reporters scribbling furiously. Even Ryan frozen in disbelief beside me. The prosecutor slammed her hand on the table. "I demand a recess, Your Honor. The court needs time to verify these allegations before this." Cleaner continues her amateur theatrics, but I didn't flinch. "Your Honor," I said firmly, "this is no performance. It's the truth Sergeant Whitaker nearly lost his career and his life for trying to reveal." The judge's gavel struck the bench with a resounding crack. "Order," he barked. The room fell silent again. He looked straight at me. "Miss, I'll allow you to continue for now, but understand if this evidence is fabricated, you'll face serious consequences." "I understand," I replied, my voice clearer than ever. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt like the person I had once dreamed of becoming. As soon as the gavel struck and the judge announced a recess, I felt the air shift. The courtroom emptied slowly, people buzzing in hushed tones. Some jurors stole glances at me, half with curiosity, half with disdain. I stayed seated, gripping the edge of the defense table. My palms were damp. My throat burned from holding back the wave of doubt clawing at me. "You were brilliant in there," Ryan said softly beside me. But his blue-gray eyes betrayed something else. Worry. Not for himself, he was watching me. I managed a thin smile. Brilliant or reckless? Both. Before I could answer, a court officer approached. "Miss Ward," he said cautiously, "there's a gentleman outside asking to speak with you. He says it's urgent." My stomach dropped. "Who?" He wouldn't give a name. Just said it's about your safety. Ryan's hand clamped gently but firmly on my arm. "You don't have to go. Stay here." But I shook my head. If it's about the case, I need to know. I followed the officer out into the marble-floored hallway. The air was colder here, sterile. A man in a tailored suit leaned casually against a pillar. His salt-and-pepper hair was slicked back, and his leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He smiled as I approached. "You're braver than I thought, Miss Ward," he said, his voice smooth but coiled with menace. "I can see why Sergeant Whitaker likes you." "Who are you?" I asked, though. My chest tightened with recognition. "Just someone who wants to save you from making a terrible mistake." He stepped closer. "Drop the evidence. Walk away from the case. If you do, there'll be a generous offer waiting for you. Enough to restart your law degree, support your family, live comfortably. And if I don't..." The smile evaporated. "Accidents happen, Hannah. Tragic accidents. Fires, car wrecks, disappearances. Don't let your stubbornness get you killed." I swallowed hard. His cologne, a sharp chemical scent, burned my nose. My legs screamed to turn to run. But then a memory cut through the fear, like sunlight through clouds. A rainy night, years ago. Me, 21, sitting on a cracked sidewalk in Queens after fainting from hunger. A young soldier, soaked, exhausted, yet kind, kneeling and pressing a $20 bill into my hand with trembling fingers. "You matter," he'd said. "Promise me you'll keep fighting." That soldier was Ryan, and now he was in there fighting for his life. The man's voice snapped me back. "Think carefully, Miss Ward." I squared my shoulders. "I already have." I turned and walked back into the courtroom before my fear betrayed me. Ryan stood when he saw me return, eyes scanning my face. "What happened?" "They tried to buy me off," I whispered. "And when that failed, they threatened me." His jaw clenched. "Damn it. I should have gone with you." "You couldn't." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Hannah listened to me. Back then, I saved you from the cold, but now you're saving me from the fire. And if they come for you again this time, I'll be your shield." Something in his tone, steady, unyielding, made my throat tighten. "You can't promise that," I said. "I can, and I will." The bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise. Court is now back in session." As we moved to take our places, I felt Ryan's presence behind me like a fortress. Whatever came next, I wasn't standing alone. I stood at the defense table, my fingers brushing the polished wood as if it could steady my trembling hands. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling notes, spectators leaning forward, waiting for me to falter. For a split second, I caught sight of the mop leaning against the wall, where I'd left it hours earlier. That mop had been my life for years, pushing it across endless hallways, listening to my sneakers squeak on wet tiles, pretending I didn't hear the laughter of lawyers in pressed suits as they swept past me like I didn't exist. What was I doing here now? A cleaner doesn't stand in court. A cleaner doesn't challenge prosecutors or speak truth to power. A cleaner stays invisible. The prosecutor's voice broke through my thoughts. "Your Honor, are we truly allowing this janitor to derail a military court?" A ripple of cruel laughter swept the room. My chest tightened. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here. I gripped the table harder and closed my eyes, and I saw my mother, sick, lying in that hospital bed years ago, tubes running from her arms like vines, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you'll finish law school, Hannah. You were meant for more than cleaning floors." I hadn't kept that promise. I'd let life and bills and grief break me, but now maybe I had a chance to make it right. I opened my eyes and saw the mop again. No, that mop didn't define me. I drew in a sharp breath and straightened my shoulders. "Your Honor." I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I may have started as a cleaner in this building, but I know this case inside out, and I have evidence that could change everything. The laughter died. The room held its breath. Ryan's gaze locked on mine from across the table. There was no pity in his eyes, only faith. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, "but if you stay, thank you." I nodded, my voice steady now. "I'm staying." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying me with an unreadable expression. "You have 15 minutes, Miss Ward. Use them wisely." I placed the folder of evidence on the table and opened it with a quiet resolve. Behind me, the mop stood like a relic of a life I was leaving behind. Whatever happened next, I wasn't Hannah the cleaner anymore. I was Hannah the fighter. The air in the courtroom felt thick, pressing down on my chest as I took a deep breath. All eyes were on me now, no longer with amusement, but with something heavier. Expectation. I opened the folder slowly, the papers inside trembling only slightly in my hands. I willed my voice to sound steady. Your Honor, the prosecution claims that Sergeant Ryan Cole acted out of personal vengeance, that he defied orders and endangered lives. I paused, scanning the room. But that narrative ignores evidence buried deep in these files. Evidence that tells a different story. A story of integrity and betrayal. I glanced at Ryan. He was sitting straight, his uniform crisp, but his face pale. Those steel-gray eyes, once cold and detached, now burned with an intensity I hadn't seen before. I turned to the prosecutor. You allege that Sergeant Cole disobeyed direct orders, I said evenly. Yet here in a memo from Colonel Davis, dated March 15th, you'll see the orders themselves were unlawful, intended to cover up a civilian casualty caused by Davis's negligence. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. You're grasping at straws, he snapped. That memo was dismissed as inadmissible hearsay. With respect, sir. I countered the original dismissal was based on the testimony of Captain Willis, who, as this court will note, received a direct transfer and commendation within weeks of signing that affidavit. A commendation signed by Colonel Davis himself. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward, his brows knitting. Are you suggesting there was a coordinated effort to suppress evidence? I met his gaze without flinching. I'm not suggesting, Your Honor. I'm proving it. The whistleblower's report corroborates everything down to the exact timestamps of falsified logs. The courtroom fell silent. Even the soft scratching of pens stopped. I could feel it the shift. Where moments ago they had seen only a cleaner fumbling in borrowed shoes, now they saw a woman who knew her case, who wouldn't back down. Ryan's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but he didn't. He just looked at me. And in that look was something I couldn't quite name. Pride, yes. Gratitude, but also a quiet awe, as if he couldn't believe the person standing in front of him was the same girl who once pushed a mop down these halls. The prosecutor's face had lost its confident edge. He shuffled papers, his voice sharp, but weaker now. Your Honor, the defense is overstepping enough, the judge said firmly. I'll allow the defense to continue. But understand, Miss Ward, any deviation from factual evidence will not be tolerated. Understood, Your Honor. I glanced once more at the mop leaning in the corner. It felt like a lifetime ago, that it was all I had. Now, I had my voice, and I wasn't giving it up. The storm outside rumbled low, a distant growl that seemed to seep into the courtroom walls. We'd taken a recess after my last statement, but the tension hadn't broken. If anything, it had grown sharper like the taut string of a bow about to snap. Ryan and I sat in the empty defense room. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced tightly. The stoic soldier facade was cracking. His eyes betrayed the war inside him. The door creaked open, and Assistant District Attorney Lewis stepped in her heels, clicking against the tiles. She shut the door behind her and crossed her arms. Miss Ward, Sergeant Cole. Her voice was smooth, almost too smooth. We don't need to drag this any further. The Colonel has authorized me to offer terms. Ryan stiffened. Terms. She set down a folder on the table, sliding it toward me with manicured fingers. A dishonorable discharge for Sergeant Cole. But no prison time. No trial. No media circus. This all goes away quietly. Ryan's head sank into his hands. For a long moment, there was only silence, punctuated by the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. This isn't a bad deal, he murmured finally, his voice hoarse. I've been fighting long enough. If it keeps my men out of the crossfire, No, the word shot out of me before I could stop it. Both of them turned to me in surprise. I pushed the folder back across the table. "We don't negotiate justice," I said quietly but firmly. "Not for a man who risked his life for the truth. Not when the real criminals still wear their uniforms and collect their pensions." Lewis arched an eyebrow. "Do you really want to gamble with his life, Miss Ward? You're not even licensed to practice law. One misstep, and he goes to prison for 20 years. Do you want that on your conscience?" "I want justice," I replied, my voice steadier now. "Not for me. Not even for him. For every soldier who believed in the system, only to be betrayed by it." Ryan stood slowly. He was staring at me now, not with anger, but with something softer, heavier. "You're braver than any soldier I know," he said almost in a whisper. My throat tightened. Lewis let out a small, frustrated sigh. "You're making a mistake. Both of you." She grabbed the folder and turned on her heel, the door clicking shut behind her. For a long time, Ryan and I didn't speak. "You should have let me take the deal," he said finally. "It would have been cleaner. Safer. Safer for who I asked. For you. For them." He shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You remind me of my sister. She used to say the same kind of reckless things. But," his eyes glistened, "maybe that's what this world needs. A little recklessness. A little courage." The bailiff knocked on the door. "Time's up. The judge is ready." Ryan offered his arm. "Shall we counsel her?" he asked with a half smile. I took it, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just about Ryan anymore. This was about the truth. And I wasn't walking away. The air in the courtroom was so heavy I could almost hear it thrum in my ears. Every breath felt borrowed. Every second stretched like an eternity. The judge's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on me, then on Ryan. His gavel hovered above the block, a single sliver of wood holding our entire world in limbo. After reviewing the new evidence presented by Miss Ward, he began voice steady, and considering the conduct of those in command. "This court finds Sergeant Ryan Cole not guilty on all charges." I didn't breathe. And furthermore, the judge continued his tone, sharpening an investigation into Colonel Hayes, and his staff will commence immediately for potential misconduct and obstruction of justice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The sound was deafening. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, like a dam breaking the room, erupted. Applause, gasps, murmurs that filled every corner. I stood frozen, clutching the edge of the defense table, afraid to move, in case this was all a dream. Ryan turned to me, his face a storm of emotions, relief, gratitude, disbelief. His hand found mine warm and strong. "You defended my honor," he whispered so only I could hear. "Now, let me defend yours." My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, I let his words settle deep into the cracks of my heart, the same heart that only days ago I thought had no place in a courtroom anymore. The flashes from the gallery cameras reminded me that this was just the beginning. The world would want to know who I was, why a cleaner with no license had dared to stand in this arena and fight. But right now, none of that mattered, because Ryan was free, and so was I. As we stepped out of the courtroom, the cold winter air hit my face, sharp and alive. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Victory didn't feel like victory. By the time we stepped outside the courthouse, the winter sky was splintered with camera flashes. Reporters shoved microphones toward me. their questions sharp and hungry. How does it feel to save a soldier's career? Are you qualified to represent anyone, Miss Ward? Do you consider yourself a hero or a fraud? Ryan's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, a silent shield against the onslaught. But once I stepped into the cold maintenance hallway of the courthouse, the one I used to mop in silence, the real battle began. My fellow cleaners didn't meet my eyes as I passed. Some whispered in corners, their voices low, but their glances sharp. "You see her," one muttered. "She thinks she's too good for us now. Next thing you know, she'll be wearing a suit and telling us how dirty our floors are," another added with a dry laugh. I wanted to tell them I was still Hannah, the same woman who brought donuts on Fridays, who stayed late to cover extra shifts. But I could feel the invisible wall rising between us. In their eyes, I had broken rank. I wasn't one of them anymore. Later that evening in the empty staff locker room, I sat on the bench staring at my hands. They still smelled faintly of bleach from the mop I'd used that morning. I dreamed of standing in court once, but I never imagined it would cost me the only community I had left. A soft knock broke my thoughts. It was Ryan standing awkwardly in the doorway. He wasn't in uniform now, just a simple jacket and jeans, but he still carried that air of purpose. "They're eating you alive out there," he said gently. "You okay?" I wanted to say yes, that the stares, the whispers, the headlines didn't bother me. But I couldn't lie. Not to him. "It's strange," I admitted. "I fought for you in that courtroom, and now it feels like I've lost everyone else." Ryan sat down across from me. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, "Sometimes standing up costs more than staying quiet. But Hannah, you're not alone." His words settled over me like a fragile shield, but deep down, I knew I couldn't rely on him to carry this weight for me. This was my fight now, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to see it through. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing endlessly. I hadn't slept much. Even with the courtroom victory echoing in headlines, my mind replayed the stares of my coworkers, the cutting whispers in the hallway. I wasn't sure which hurt more, the way they looked at me like a stranger, or the way I had started believing them. When I finally answered the call, it was Ryan. "Hannah." His voice was calm but firm. "I need to see you." We met at a small diner near the courthouse, the kind of place where nobody cared about headlines or uniforms. He looked different out of his dress blues, less like the decorated soldier, and more like the man I'd seen that rainy night years ago, when he handed me a $20 bill and said, "You matter." "You've been quiet," he said, studying me over his coffee mug. "I've been thinking," I admitted, "about quitting." His words weren't judgmental, but they landed heavy. I didn't answer. He leaned forward. "Hannah, you don't have to go back to the mop. You don't have to fade away again. It's not that simple," I said softly. "I left law school for a reason, Ryan. Maybe I wasn't cut out for that world." "You weren't cut out for their world," he corrected. "But the law needs people like you, the ones who fight because they care not, because it's profitable." I looked away. It's been years. I don't even know if I belong there anymore. "Hannah." Ryan's voice softened. "You stood in that courtroom and tore apart their lies with nothing but your memory and your courage. Don't tell me you don't belong." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again, a new email notification. I almost ignored it, but something in the subject line caught my eye. "Full tuition scholarship. Your future." I opened it with trembling hands. It was from a private foundation I'd never heard of. They congratulated me on a remarkable act of courage and integrity, and offered to sponsor my return to law school at any accredited university of my choice. No application, no interviews, just a single line at the bottom. Consider this an investment in the kind of lawyer the world needs. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold. Good news, Ryan asked. I showed him the email, my hands shaking slightly. He read it, then met my gaze with a faint smile. Sounds like someone out there believes in you as much as I do. I don't understand, I whispered. Why me? Why now? Maybe because you've already proven you'll fight for people who can't fight for themselves. For a moment, I let the possibility settle over me. But with it came fear. Fear of stepping into a world that had once rejected me. Fear of failing again. Fear of what I'd have to leave behind if I dared to try. I'm not sure I can do this, I admitted. And I'm not sure I deserve it. Ryan shook his head. You deserve every chance at the life you dreamed of. The question isn't whether you're ready for law school, Hannah. It's whether law school is ready for you. I wanted to believe him. But as I stared at the words on my phone screen, one thought kept echoing in my mind. What if stepping forward means losing everything I've clung to for so long? The envelope felt heavier than it should have. It sat in my lap as I stared out the bus window, watching Manhattan blur by. Rain streaked across the glass, and for a moment I thought about turning back. This wasn't just a form with my name on it. It was a piece of my old life, a dream I had buried under years of regret and mop water. When I stepped off the bus, the NYU Law Building loomed ahead, like a giant from another time. The last time I walked these steps, my world had been falling apart. I clutched the envelope tighter. Are you sure about this? Ryan's voice broke through my thoughts. He was standing a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, watching me with that quiet steadiness he always seemed to carry. No, I admitted, but maybe that's the point. Ryan smiled faintly. You don't have to be sure. You just have to take the first step. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We walked together up the stone steps. The doors felt impossibly tall, like they were testing me one last time. At the admissions office, I handed over my envelope with trembling hands. The clerk took it with a polite smile, completely unaware of the storm inside me. As we stepped back into the hallway, Ryan reached out and gently squeezed my shoulder. The law needs your voice, Hannah, he said softly. Don't ever forget that. I wanted to tell him how much those words meant to me. How in a world full of noise and power and cruelty, he was the one person who had seen me not as a cleaner, not as a dropout, but as a person who still had something to give. But before I could speak, Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. What is it? I asked. He hesitated for half a beat before forcing a small smile. Nothing, he said. Just work. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the weight he was trying to hide. Later, as we parted ways on the sidewalk, my phone buzzed with a new message. It wasn't from Ryan. It was from an unknown number. Ryan has been recalled to active duty. He ships out in 2 weeks. My heart dropped. The door to my future had finally opened. But was I about to lose the person who had helped me find it? 5 years changes everything and nothing at all. This morning, as I stood outside the federal courthouse, the air felt heavier than I remembered. Reporters crowded the marble steps, their microphones like weapons, their questions slicing through the January wind. "Ms. Taylor, do you really think you can win against the army? Are you prepared for the backlash?" I kept my head high. I'd learned over these years how to hold my own in the storm. "I'm prepared to fight," I said evenly, "for those who can't." 5 years ago, I was scrubbing these very floors invisible to the world. Now my name was on the docket as lead counsel in a case that could change military law forever. But as I walked into the courtroom, a familiar weight settled on my chest. Ryan. I hadn't seen him since the day I submitted my application to NYU. 2 weeks later, he shipped out to a combat zone, and we never really said goodbye. And now, there he was. He sat quietly on the witness bench shoulders, straight uniform immaculate. His eyes, those same steady gray eyes, met mine for the briefest moment. 5 years, and still that look could knock the breath out of me. I remembered the day he'd said, "The law needs your voice." I remembered the day I found out he'd been sent back into danger. I remembered every letter I wrote, but never sent. But there was no time for memories. The bailiff called the court to order. "Your Honor, we are ready to proceed," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. This wasn't just another case. This was the one Ryan had unknowingly handed me 5 years ago. He wasn't the accused this time. He wasn't the man fighting for his own honor. Today, Ryan Miller was my key witness. And if we failed, countless soldiers like him would remain silenced forever. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Judgment in favor of the plaintiffs. The army is ordered to compensate the victims and institute reforms within 6 months. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the sound came soft at first, like rain against glass. Applause. I felt my knees weaken. 5 years ago, I had stood in a courtroom with a mop in my hand, terrified to raise my voice. Today, I had spoken for hundreds who couldn't. The judge nodded at me, his expression softer than I'd seen all trial. "Ms. Taylor, this court commends your courage." Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, but all I could see was Ryan. He was standing now still in his uniform, his cap held respectfully against his chest. Our eyes locked across the room. "You changed the world, Hannah," he said quietly as I walked over. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "No," I whispered back. I just remembered I had a voice. The courtroom began to empty, but we stayed there a moment longer. 2 people who had seen each other at their lowest, now standing in the light. Ryan smiled faintly. "Back then, I thought I was saving you. Turns out you were the one saving me all along." I laughed softly. We saved each other. And maybe that's how change happens. Not in grand gestures, not in headlines, but in quiet moments of bravery when someone decides to stand up, even if their hands are still shaking. There's a mop hanging on the wall of my office. It's old, the handle cracked in 2 places, the threads worn to nothing. Anyone else might mistake it for junk. To me, it's a reminder of the day I stopped cleaning up after the world and started standing up to it. When I first walked into this courtroom as a janitor, I thought invisible people like me didn't get to speak. That justice belonged to the powerful, the educated, the ones who'd never worried about rent or immigration papers. But I was wrong. Ryan taught me that. Not with words, but with the way he looked at me that day, like I mattered. Now, as I watch him leave the courthouse medals glinting on his chest, I know he defended more than a uniform. He defended my belief in myself even when I couldn't. And I defended him. But more than that, I defended me, the version of me who sat in law school lectures dreaming of changing lives, the girl who almost let her mother's death extinguish her fire, the woman who thought she was too small to matter. I touched the mop gently, a smile tugging at my lips. They'll say you were just a cleaner once I whisper, but I'll know you were the start of everything. Outside, I hear Ryan's voice. You coming, counselor? I turn toward the door, my briefcase in hand, and answer without hesitation. Yes, but this time, I lead.